Hello again. There is currently in Europe and the United States something of a mad obsession with the transatlantic slave trade, which saw somewhere between 10 and 12 million people transported from West Africa to the Americas and the Caribbean. This was, of course, a ghastly business, but it was not the worst type of slave trade inflicted upon Africa. That which took place on the other side of the continent lasted for many centuries longer than the transatlantic slave trade, and far more people died as a result of it. It's a very, very big subject. I just want to skim through a few main points of what was happening in East Africa over the last few thousand years, because it does serve to put the transatlantic slave trade into some sort of proper perspective. For thousands of years, slaves were captured in East Africa and transported to the Middle East, usually via Egypt or Yemen. This was going on at the time of the pharaohs and was also big business in the Aksumite Empire, which covered modern-day Eritrea and Yemen. Like other civilizations of the time, Aksum, which flourished in the early centuries of the Common Era, traded in slaves. Traders and explorers from the Arabian Peninsula were also active much further south, perhaps even as early as they were in Aksum. On the coast of East Africa, which is today part of Kenya and Tanzania, the clues are very clear to see. After all, the capital of Tanzania is Dar es Salaam, a name with obvious Arabic origins. The chief language spoken in that part of Africa is Swahili, the most widely spoken indigenous language in the whole of Africa. Swahili was known colloquially at one time as Coast Arabic because of the large number of Arabic expressions and loanwords which it contains. The very name of the language itself is derived from the Arabic word Sawahil, which means coast. Two things brought the Arabs this far south from their homeland: ivory and slaves. These two valuable commodities went together, and the trade in one stimulated the other as a matter of course. Ivory is obtained from the tusks of elephants, although the horn of the narwhal and tusks of walrus also yield this useful substance. Ivory, of course, could be carved into ornaments, used for jewellery and combs, inlaid in wood to decorate furniture, and for 100 other things. We take plastic so much for granted these days that perhaps we seldom stop to ask ourselves what the Victorians say would have used for piano keys or billiard balls. For thousands of years, ivory was seen as one of the most useful and versatile materials in the world, which of course accounts for the fact that elephants have in the past been driven almost to extinction. There was one slight difficulty in collecting ivory in Africa, and that was that elephant tusks are very large and heavy. The average tusk is something over 6 foot in length and weighs between 50 and 100 pounds. Once the Arab traders in search of ivory had landed on the coast of East Africa and then travelled many miles into the interior of the continent until they came across elephants, they had to ask themselves how on earth they were to transport such weighty items as the tusks back to their ships. The answer to this problem was brilliant. If Africans could be captured and made into slaves, then they could carry the tusks, if necessary, for hundreds of miles back to where the ships lay waiting. Instead of just ivory, the Arabs now had two useful things to sell when they returned to their homeland. The quest for ivory in East Africa thus became closely linked with the acquisition of slaves. Not only was this a way of avoiding the ruinously high costs which using hired labour would have entailed, it effectively doubled the profit for each expedition. Long before Europeans began exploiting West Africa for slaves, the coast on the other side of the continent was the exclusive province of Arab slavers. They built ports and started settlements there, from which they exported ivory and slaves to North Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. For the Aksumites, the people that lived in what is now Eritrea and Yemen, the chief focus of trade had been to the east, They exported slaves to India, Sri Lanka and so on. For the Arabs, it was north into their own lands. It is by no means impossible that it was the Sabians who influenced the Arabs to look to Africa as a source of slaves. The Sabians were the people that lived in the south of what is now called the Arabian Peninsula, Saudi Arabia, the bit towards Yemen and Oman. It's possible that it's no coincidence that Yemen, the original home of the Sabians, is next to Oman. It was Oman which later came to dominate the island of Zanzibar and also the coast of East Africa. Zanzibar and what used to be called Tanganyika in colonial times, now combined together to form one country, Tanzania, of course. Arab influence on what is sometimes called the Swahili coast of Kenya and Mozambique dates back well over 1,000 years. There is evidence of Arab architectural design in the style of buildings from about the 8th century onward in that part of Africa. This was, of course, a time when the Arabs were expanding at breakneck speed from their traditional homeland and forging their way across North Africa and into Europe, and also into the rest of the Middle East and Persia. It's hardly surprising that their influence should have begun to stretch south as well. It is impossible to say how many slaves were trafficked from East Africa in ancient times. It's only much later, during the 19th century, that it's possible to calculate the numbers involved. Before examining the terrible effects of the Arab slave trade in Africa, we might ask ourselves what happened to all the slaves who were rounded up and taken to the markets of Zanzibar or towns on the borders between Ethiopia and Sudan. The island of Zanzibar and certain towns on the coast of what is now Kenya and Tanzania were really staging posts where slaves were put up for sale before being exported to the Arabian Peninsula, Egypt, Turkey, or even as far away as India. Those who were taken instead to markets in Ethiopia often ended up just in Egypt. During the 17th and 18th centuries, there was a brisk trade in slaves in Zanzibar. But then in the first decades of the 19th century, a situation arose which meant that Zanzibar itself also required a large body of slave labour. As the British gradually brought to an end the plantations worked by slave labour in their own possessions in the Caribbean, so at the same time this system began in Zanzibar. The crop was cloves. The clove tree originated in the Malacca Islands of Indonesia and was exported from there by Asian traders first to China and then Egypt and Europe. When the Portuguese and Dutch arrived in Indonesia in the 16th century, both countries attempted to establish a worldwide monopoly for the market in cloves. The clove plantations of Zanzibar were every bit as harsh for slaves as those in the southern states of America. Although we've seldom hear about them, we're all familiar with the plantations of Georgia and, we all know about the plantations they're mentioned in Gone with the Wind. I don't suppose one viewer in 1,000 has ever heard about the plantations in Zanzibar, cloves. And yet they were just as cruel for black slaves as the American plantations were. And there were probably more slaves in Zanzibar working on those plantations as well. Estimates as to the number of black Africans who were taken from their homes in the course of the East African slave trade vary dramatically. The highest estimates are made by African historians, and in his book on the subject, Senegalese author Tidjane Ndaya settles on a figure of 17 million over the course of some centuries. This was, it is suggested, made up of 8 million people transported north from East Africa across the Sahara Desert, and another 9 million who passed through the markets in Zanzibar and other slave trading ports on the coast of what are now Kenya and Tanzania. It has to be said that some historians find such figures absurdly large. Abdulaziz Elodi, Professor of Swahili and African Linguistics at the University of Uppsala in Sweden, points out with some justification that accurate figures are simply not available. Roger Coupland, an acknowledged expert on the slave trade in East Africa, who between 1920 and 1948 held the Bett Professorship of Colonial History at the University of Oxford, concluded after decades of study that between 80,000 and 100,000 people in East Africa died each year during the 19th century as a result of the slave trade. This figure included not only those who were taken from their homes and ended up as slaves in the Middle East or North Africa, but also the many who were massacred incidentally to the slave trade. If this figure is accurate, then in the 19th century alone, some 10 million black Africans were killed as a result of the slave trade in East Africa. This does rather put the transatlantic slave trade into perspective. As usual, I give references in the description to this video for those who wish to look further into this matter, because the slave trade in East Africa has, to say the least of it, been somewhat neglected in Europe and North America.